Hello, and welcome back to the competitive biography of Emanuel Lasker. In the previous video, we took a look at round number 1 of the final stage of the Breslau 1889 Hauptturnier, and today we will be taking a look at round number 5. Let's briefly recap what happened in between. Round number 2 is when Lasker got his bye, and in round number 3, his win over Ignaz von Popiel was not recorded, at least not in the tournament book. Now, in round number 4, he played against Lorenzo Mabilis, and while that game was recorded, I didn't really feel like it deserved to have its own video because the game itself is not very good and has essentially zero independent value. For those of you who are wishing to see it, I will put a link in the description to a very quick 6-minute rambling video I made on it. It's not worth watching in and of itself, but for any of you who want to see every game possible in this saga, it's there for any of you completionists. Round number 5, on the other hand, it does have tremendous independent value and is in my opinion the best game of the entire tournament. Now Lasker's opponent in this round is Paul Lipke. And rather than talk about Lipke's historical achievements, I'm going to bring to your attention something that I have not so far, which is the score from group number 2. As we can see, Paul Lipke won this group with an 8.5 out of 9 score, half a point more than Lasker got in his commanding performance in group number 1. It is without question that these two were the overwhelming favorites going into this group, and I would say that for contemporary spectators, this was the game to watch. And I can assure you, it lived up to the hype. This game is too good to delay, so we're going to jump into it right away. Lasker, with his first time behind the white pieces in this entire tournament it seems, opens with e4, we have e5, and now a newcomer to the arena, knight to c3, the Vienna game. Knight to f6, and Lasker opts for g3, known as the Mises variation. Now Jacques Mises, the German master after whom this opening is named, played this opening 3 times in the master tournament, scoring 1 win and 2 draws with it. Lipke continues with bishop to c5. We have bishop to g2, castles, knight g to e2, d6, castles, and knight to c6. Nothing out of the ordinary so far. Mises himself played the move h3 the year prior in late 1888 against another German master, Kurt von Bartheleben, but here Lasker decides to instead go for the move d3. Now here Lipke decides to play the move bishop to e6, which is a reasonable move. It's not the one the tournament book prefers. They prefer the move knight to e7, their idea being that the move knight to d5 can be met with knight f captures d5, e captures d5, and now f5, and this would give black a decent amount of initiative. Furthermore, if bishop to g5 was played, then this knight is able to retreat to e8, and now knight to d5 could be met with f6. White's going to have to trade something off, and their central pressure is really not that much to deal with. The bishop pair clearly doesn't impress the author, as they don't mention the move knight to a4, which I reckon would be a really good try for white, but it's a moot point, as bishop to e6 was played. Here Lipke's idea is that he's going to meet the incoming knight to d5 by trading off the bishop pair. Bishop captures d5, e captures d5, and only now knight back to e7. Now his idea is clear, he's going to double attack the pawn, and Lasker defends this tactically with bishop to g5. Now of course the pawn can't be taken, because if one of the knights takes it, then the other one is pinned. White can simply pick up the knight and they're up a piece for nothing. So what does black play here? I found one other game in the database which went knight to g6. This was played in 2017 by Aramis Alvarez Pedraza against Juan Borges Mateos, and interestingly it was on move 10 that the players agreed to a draw. So definitely not the most exciting game in the world. Here Lipke decides to play knight to d7, and this move is a novelty. So it's as of move 10 that the players are playing a unique game. Now Lasker, once again on the side facing the novelty, plays a really strong move to fix his pawn structure, d4. E captures d4, and now knight captures on d4, so the doubled pawn is dealt with. h6 kicks the bishop back to e3, and now Lipke plays the move knight to e5. I would say this move is somewhat of a strategic misstep, given that white's 2 advantages in this position are the bishop pair and this really annoying pawn here on d5. This move is certainly not bad in and of itself, but I do think that Lipke could do more to combat at least one of these advantages, starting with the move knight to b6. Now how does white deal with the double attack on this pawn? A really big concern is that this knight is semi-pinned. If you ever move it to add the queen as a defender, then black is more than happy to trade off the bishops, and now the e-pawn is weak. Things like rook to e8 will make this pawn really hard to defend. Another way to assign a defender is something like queen to h5, but now black gets in the move knight to c4, and you're either going to pick off the bishop pair or perhaps win this pawn here on b2. One move that I looked at that I found really interesting was simply bishop to c1 retreating, the idea being that white is going to gambit this pawn. Any of the knight captures on b5 and now c4, and the argument is that white will look to play on the queen side as the bishop has been opened up. It's an interesting move, and you certainly get a game out of this. But Lipke played the move knight to e5, and we continue on normally. Queen to e2 and queen to d7, both players connect up their rooks. h3 from Lasker, taking away any control of the g4 square. Rook a to e8, and rook a to e1. Now again, it's Lipke's turn to find a move, and this is sort of where I'm saying that knight to e3 was something of a strategic misstep because it doesn't really have too many active plans here. He decides to simply pass the move back to Lasker by playing a6, but the problem is that Lasker does have a very active plan, as we'll see. The tournament book seems to think that he should be playing the move queen to a4, going after the a pawn, and indeed, white can give up this pawn because the queen gets trapped. Right, rook a1, queen a2, queen b2, excuse me, rook fb1, queen c3, knight b5, queen b4, and finally rook a4 traps the queen. Simple as that. But here, after queen to b4, they give the move c4 and now queen to b6, and this indeed is a very active diagonal. I'm not super convinced with this because after rook to d1, simply defending the knight, the onus is again on black to come up with a move. It's a tricky position, but after a6, here Lasker can really start playing the game in full spirits. f4, kicking the knight back, it goes to g6, and now queen to f2. Here Lasker really threatens the move f5, and if he gets this in, then black is going to be in a whole lot of trouble. Black doesn't really have a good way to stop it. If you play f5 yourself, then you simply hand the e6 square to the knight on a silver platter, and this would just be miserable. So Lipke is forced to trade here on d4, bishop captures d4, and now the knight can jump to f5. But here Lasker simply retreats to c3. The bishop served its defensive purposes for quite a while, both on g5 and on e3, and now it's very aggressively placed here on the long diagonal. Now Lipke has been playing very well, let me tell you. He has been a cut above pretty much everyone else we've seen so far, but he has yet to equalize. He does his best though. Rook captures e1, rook captures e1, and now rook to e8, offering to swap all of the rooks off, and Lasker agrees after making the subtle improving move bishop to f3. We'll see this move come in handy very shortly. Rook captures e1 with check, queen captures e1, and now knight f back to e7. Here we have king to g2, got to defend the h3 pawn, and now Lipke is faced with a choice. Does he play purely defensively, or does he look for counter chances? If you want to find a useful defensive move, one that I found that's really nice is the move h5. If white takes, then black gets the d5 pawn, so that doesn't really do much. And if you play h4, stopping black from playing h4, then the f5 square is nice and open, queen to f5 comes, and it looks like black is doing all right so far. But Lipke plays queen to a4, following the time-old mantra, if you're going to die, die on a full stomach. So, queen to d2 from Lasker. He accepts that the a2 pawn is going to fall, but he's going to get compensation for it. Queen captures a2, and now queen to d4. Very straightforward, checkmating threat. This is dealt with through f6, and now queen to e4. And this shows off a decent amount of compensation. These knights are sort of tripping on each other's toes, and they need to defend each other. Here we have queen to b1 from Lipke, and now h4. h5 is of course a threat to simply lose a piece, so Lipke defends one of his knights, king to f8, now the other one is free to move, but bishop to h5. Now you're certainly not going to be doing anything to defend this knight, so what do you do? The move knight to h8 was written off by the commentators, who note that queen to h7 is really strong. The idea being that after the knight moves to f7, then simply bishop captures on f6 and white wins. And indeed, black will get checkmated rather quickly here. What they missed was the very stellar defense, and I do not blame them for missing this move, knight to g8. Now, pretty much nothing is forced in this variation, but let's look at the principal idea. Queen captures on h8. Makes sense. Well, we have queen captures on c2 with check, and since the queen has unrestricted access to c1, c2, and d3, the white king can't really escape the checks if they stay on the first two ranks. So I think king to h3 is the serious attempt to win the game. But now, queen to f5 check. You have to block somehow, so let's say bishop to g4, and now queen captures on d5, threatening queen to h1 checkmate. So the king has to draw back to h2, but now queen back to d3. The white queen is stuck in the corner, and the black king will continue to be assaulted by checks. Now this is an incredibly imbalanced endgame. Black has picked up 3 pawns in exchange for the piece, and the material imbalance is more active on the field as well. White has 2 bishops out here, there's 1 black queen. These 2 pieces are sort of tied up back at home and nobody really knows when they're going to get out. This is just as unbalanced as an endgame gets. Now the engine gives the lovely 0.00 as usual, but I hope you'll agree that this is really little solace in the middle of a game. But as mentioned, everyone missed this move, and again, I don't blame them. Sacrificing a piece on h8 is really difficult to come up with in the moment. Lipke decides to play the move f5, simply cutting off the queen's attack on the knight. But this move, unfortunately, gets him in a lot of trouble, simply because queen to d4 reopens this attack here on the pawn, and now how do you defend it? Well, Lipke decides to really put Lasker to the sword here. Queen captures on c2 with check, winning another pawn, king to h3, and now queen to e4. And I would say that this is a very challenging defense. Here, Lipke has won 2 pawns, and he's offering a queen trade. Now, obviously, you cannot take this. You're down 2 pawns, you're going to lose the endgame. And he's sort of hanging this sword of Damocles over Lasker's head. Queen to h1 checkmate is a threat that you really can't ignore. So Lipke is saying that your attack must succeed, or you lose. Let the attack begin. Queen captures g7 with check. King to e8, and now bishop captures on g6 with check. King to d7, and now we reach what I think is the critical moment of the game. You're in Lasker's shoes. Find the move here. Better yet, find the sequence of moves, because there really aren't that many moves to choose from in this position, and you're going to need to have a little bit of foresight to find the move that actually works here. All right, let's take stock of things here. White really only has a couple of ways to not lose this position, because again, queen to h1 is a threat that you really cannot deal with on its own. King to h2 is one way to escape this, and after queen to e2 check, you can really stop your analysis here, as the white king can never escape the checks. You're going to be stuck on the first 2 ranks. There's always going to be a black queen check. White might even lose if they go back to h3, because after queen to g4 check, you actually lose the bishop, so this might get a little awkward. But the move you have to find here as white is bishop captures on f5 with check. This is the other move you can play. Now after queen captures f5, again, the only move here you have that doesn't draw the game is queen to g4. Now let's take stock of what we're asking for here. Queen captures g4 with check, king captures g4, and now knight captures on d5. So here Lipke is up a pawn in the endgame, and the immediate threat here that white has of bishop to g7 runs into knight to e3 with check, king to h5, and knight to f5. And if you want to trade off here, then black has very excellent chances of holding this king endgame because the d-pawn runs. However, here Lasker had the foresight to play the very pretty move, bishop to d2. Now again, let's take a moment to take stock of this. Lipke is up a pawn, and it really looks like he has the good knight versus the bad bishop. So Lasker is banking on his very active king and far advanced kingside pawns to counteract this. Let's see what happens. Knight to f6 from Lipke. Check. King to f5, and now king to e7. Now here Lasker plays the move g4, which is unfortunately not the correct move. He's still doing fine, but this isn't the correct way to play. The surgically precise way to play this endgame is king to g6. Now, if you win this pawn, then I think it's fair to say that white is very easily winning this game. If you play the move h5, defending it through the knight, then f5 comes and black's house of cards will fall very quickly once the bishop gets to g5. Knight to e4 is another option. After bishop to e3, you can play knight captures on g3. But here again, f5 will come. This pawn is going to be won eventually, and black is really doubly messed up in this position. The knight's going to have trouble against this rook pawn anyway, and on top of that, it promotes on the same color as the bishop. So black is going to lose this endgame. After g4, Lipke misses one correct move here. He plays the move d5, which is bad for a couple reasons. If he played king to f7, this would keep him in the fight. g5 is threatened, and now he can move the knight to d5. Now if g captures on h6, then the knight is free to move back to f6. The h7 square is covered, and white has a lot of work to do. And if king to e4 going after the knight, then the knight can jump back to e7, and after the pawn moves, can go to g8. And again, you're covering all of the kingside squares. There's going to be a lot left for white to prove here. d5, as we've seen, takes away the d5 square from the knight, and this loses for Lipke. g5, as planned. Now the king is slightly too far away to make a difference, the knight is deprived of its best square, and Lasker converts, as we'll see. H captures g5, and now f captures on g5. The knight drops back to d7, and now g6. King back to f8, and now h5. The pawns are rolling. Here Lipke's king is close enough so he can take a timeout to play the move d4. Somewhat useful, you do want to keep the bishop off the long diagonal if possible. h6, king to g8, h7 with check. The king slides over to h8, so now both of the pawns for the time being are accounted for, but Lasker still has a king. King to e6, and after knight to f8 with check, Lasker played king to f7, and it was here on move 47 that Paul Lipke resigned the game. After this, really black can't do any more than choose how they want to get mated. If they do nothing, then g7 and g8 creating a queen is checkmate. The longest way to prolong the mate would be knight to e6, where after king captures e6, king to g7, h8 creates a queen, and after you retake, we have king to f7, and again, we're in the exact same position where g7, g8 is mate. The most interesting mate I found is after knight captures g6, king captures g6. When you play any move here, white is simply going to play bishop to f4, or bishop to g5, or bishop to h6, and there's no way that you can stop white from checkmating on the long diagonal. So yeah, like I said, this is the most entertaining game of the round, I think. Lipke didn't play badly. He had a very difficult position to defend up until here, move 29. And if he'd have found knight to h8, that would have been an incredible defense. But of course, f5 is a very reasonable move to think about. But unfortunately, he just wasn't able to properly see far enough ahead that the endgame Lasker was going into was actually winning for white. But that's sort of the thing that you would rarely expect people to come up with. That endgame did not look like it was better for white in any capacity up to here. He's down a pawn. He's got the worse minor piece. This is, in my opinion, Lasker's magnum opus for this tournament. So yeah, that is round number 5 of the Breslau 1889 Hauptturnier. There are still more games from this tournament to cover, so we're not quite done with this yet. I look forward to seeing you for the rest of them, and until then.